Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.
Hello, I'm Lorene Mills, and welcome to Report from Santa Fe. Our guest today is Richard Louv, an extraordinary author and journalist. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks, Lorene.
Well, your book that really put you on the map, you've got 8 books, you've got lots of articles, You've been on NPR, television, all those things. Your books are in, 15 languages, 20 countries. Yeah. But you did something, you really changed the world when you wrote this one. This is called The Last Child in the World, in the Woods, The Last Child in the Woods. And what's the subtitle?
Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder.
Nature Deficit Disorder. Yeah. And the vitamin that you take for nature deficit disorder is the title of your latest book, Vitamin N, The Essential Guide to a Nature-Rich Life. So we're going to talk about these. You have some other books. Tell us a little about your background.
I was a journalist for a long time. I guess I still am. I was a columnist for the Union Tribune for 24 years and had written a lot of books and grew up in Kansas City. And I love New Mexico. I'm trying to talk my wife into moving here.
Good. Now, among your many awards, you received the Audubon Medal, which was awarded to Rachel Carson. Your book, The Last Child in the Woods, has been compared to her Silent Spring. I mean, that's as good as it gets. Jimmy Carter also got the Audubon Medal. And you also hosted, or you were the keynote speaker at the first White House conference on environmental education.
Yeah.
What was that like?
It was interesting because this was the very first White House summit on environmental education, the first one they ever did. And I was asked to give the keynote. And right after I got to D.C. to do this, I learned that I'd been asked to do this right after the administration had cut $35 million from the budget, basically everything in the federal budget for environmental education. So I said, now I've got to be an apologist for this. So I was, fortunately, they shifted me to the end keynote, and they sacrificed the Secretary of Interior at the beginning because we were looking at 150 very angry environmental educators.
Yeah.
So at the end, I'd had enough time to think about this. So I said, I woke up this morning thinking about the movie Jaws. I know that's terribly environmentally incorrect, but I don't care. I like that movie. And the reason I was thinking is I was thinking that moment when they're out on the ocean, they figure out just how big a shark they're up against. And somebody says, we need a bigger boat. So I said to the environmental educators, we need a bigger boat. As long as environmental educators only talk to environmental educators, they lose. As long as conservationists only talk to conservationists, you lose. On and on. We live in silos. And by a bigger boat, I mean a movement to create a constituency for environmental education, for conservation, for connecting people, particularly kids, to nature. And that movement is happening. It's already out there.
Well, this book, Last Child in the Woods, is a clarion call. This is the kind of book from which movements spring. And you talk about nature deficit disorder, saving our children from nature deficit disorder, and we all have a sense of what that is. But how do you choose to define that?
Well, first I always clarify this is not a known medical diagnosis. Maybe it should be, but it's not. It is, though, a way to describe the effects of the alienation from nature, not only on children but on adults as well. And my second book was called The Nature Principle, and that's about the same topic but for adults. And basically it is the fact that particularly children, but that means eventually adults, because children do grow up, are increasingly disconnected from nature. This is unprecedented in human history, that children, their formative years, so few hours would be spent in the natural world.
You even say that our children are the first generation to be raised without meaningful contact with the natural world.
Now, Not all children. Some children still do. Many
Yes.
children still do. But the quantity of that is going down and has been going down for about 30 years and rapidly accelerating. And that has lots of implications. It has implications for physical health, psychological health, cognitive functioning, a sense of having your own place in the world. And that's what I call nature deficit disorder.
Well, the world has changed so much, and you address this very beautifully in your book. It's the year 2008 that the balance shifted, and there were more people living in cities than were living in the country. And let's look a little bit about what we've lost in that transition.
Yeah, and that's in the whole world. That's the first time in
Yes, in the whole
human
world.
history that the
Yeah.
whole world. Well, what that means is that either as urbanization continues, and it will, that means one of two things. Either our species will continue to lose whatever connection that we have to the natural world, or it means the beginning of a new kind of city, a city filled with nature, a nature-rich city. There's no reason that cities can't become engines of biodiversity. I like that second option a lot better than the first.
Well, there's a lot of visions of the future that are very dystopic, and that paint these very grim, urban, slum-like, enslaved cities where there's there are not flowers and sunshine and butterflies.
Yeah.
And it's very important to counter that, because we really do have a choice.
Yeah.
Decisions we all make every day will decide which way the future goes.
And there's good news here, which is finally the people who study human development, particularly child development, after ignoring this issue of how nature itself, the natural world, affects that development, finally they started studying this. And there was some research out when I wrote Last Child in the Woods. Now that research has increased hugely. And it all points in the same direction. That attention deficit disorder, for instance, University of Illinois shows that just a little bit of contact with nature for kids with the symptoms of attention deficit disorder, they get much better. A recent study of 900 schools in Massachusetts found that green schools, and I don't mean solar panels, I mean, a school garden,
Yeah.
nature around the school, kids going out on field trips, that green schools compared to non-green schools, when you factor out the socioeconomic factors, the kids in the green schools do much better on standardized testing than the kids who go to non-green schools. And again, they factored out all the issues that might throw that off. In so many ways, we're now finding that our connection to the natural world is vital, particularly to children in their developing years, but for all of us. And we can turn this around. And this movement that's out there is doing that. There's tens of thousands of people who are deeply dedicated to turning this around.
I do love all the research that you've kind of compiled here. One that fascinated me was they studied prisoners, some of whom looked out on a concrete wall, some of whom looked out on a courtyard with trees in it, and the difference in their mental health and in their behavior was quantifiable.
Yeah, and hospitals have known this for a while. Many hospitals have rooms with a lot of nature in them, garden rooms for families to sit in when they're worried and all of that. But also, it's now known that a view out of a hospital window onto nature, you actually heal faster. You don't need as much pain medication when you're in the hospital. So, people who use biophilic architecture, that's using nature in the architecture itself, but around the building, in the building. The people who work in those buildings are far more productive. Sick time goes down, turnover gets better. So what if whole cities were like that?
Yeah. Let's look at children, because you start this book with your own son asking you, saying, how come it was more fun when you were a kid?
Yeah.
And I think it was more fun when we were kids. I mean, remember that you would just go outside and play all day. There was nobody helicopter momming you, hovering over you to be sure nothing happened. You would jump off things, fall down, and just come back at dinner time. There was just, and kids would discover things, and kids would build their own reality just from their own experiences.
Yeah.
It wasn't all spoon-fed them.
Yeah.
What did you say to him?
Well, first I was surprised that he said that, because I thought his childhood was great,
Yeah.
as far as
It was
I could
your job,
tell.
actually, to make sure he had
Yeah.
a great childhood.
And but it was many of those things. It was actually the stories that I would tell. My boyhood was filled with stories, because we invented our own stories.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't a video game making it for us. And every generation thinks that their childhood is better than the generation before, so we have to factor a little of that into that. But in fact, when you do look at this research, and I interviewed many, many parents and kids to do this work, the benefits to cognitive functioning, to psychological health, the reduction of depression, the reduction of toxic stress, not only for children but for adults. No wonder it at least feels like it was better. No wonder we made up our own stories.
Yeah.
We were, I think, in many ways happier. And again, I'm hesitant to say one generation is happier than the next, but I think we're out of balance. I'm not anti-tech.
Well, that's what you call for. It's such a beautiful to balance the
Yeah.
virtual
Yeah.
world and the technical world with the natural world.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily 50-50 when I talk about,
Uh-huh.
I mean, ideally you'd have more of the natural world than you would with than you would technology. But when you look at the schools, for instance, I know there was a recent funding of more time in the classroom spent on computers and panels and other teaching tools like that. And my feeling was, if you're going to require an hour and a half of kids to be on a computer every day in school, why not package in at least an hour and a half of being outside in nature as
Yeah.
well as that? And, I think education should have a new mantra, which would be for every dollar we spend on the virtual, we need to spend at least another dollar on the real, particularly on experiences in nature, because we know how that affects kids. We know how that helps in so many ways.
You describe a child being asked where he liked to play the most, inside or outside. He said inside, because that's where the electrical outlets are.
Yeah.
And you, as a statistic, I'm sure you've updated it, was that the average child might spend as much as 44 hours a week plugged in to various electronic media.
Yeah,
it's
that's
probably more now.
That's the Kaiser Family Foundation
Oof.
did that study, and at first it was 44 hours a week, and then they updated that just a few years later, and they found it was up to, I think, 54 to 56 hours a week. And they were stunned. Where do those hours come from?
Yeah.
And it plugged into some kind of electronic gadget.
You describe television as the most effective thief of time. And you'd say, unlike television, nature doesn't steal time, it amplifies time.
Yeah, right.
And that's what we're wanting. Also,
Yeah.
you mentioned that Steve Jobs didn't want his own kids to be sucked into iPads.
Yeah, he wouldn't let them use iPads.
Yeah.
And here's part of the irony. The technology industries are really pushing a lot of computers and now even video games into the schools as teaching tools. But in a sense, they know better. It's amazing how many and I'm not saying that technology shouldn't be in the schools, but it's amazing how many of the leaders in Silicon Valley have cabins off the grid in the mountains that they go to in order to recharge themselves and come back and be better programmers or whatever. I wish that they would emerge as some of the leaders of this new nature movement.
We're speaking today with Richard Louv, and we're talking about his books, The Last Child in the Woods, and this one, in case people haven't figured out how to go from here to how to fix it, vitamin N 500 ways to enrich the health and happiness of your family and community in nature. So the question is, what is it going to take to get people back outdoors again?
Well, it takes a movement. It doesn't just take a village. It takes a movement, and that is happening. The reason for Vitamin N, which will be out in April, my publisher tells me to remind people they can pre-order it from their bookstores or Amazon. The reason for Vitamin N, that's 500 things that
And they're
families,
fun, wonderful things.
yeah, that either families or whole communities can do. It's important that this isn't just laid on the shoulders of the parents. The whole community can do things to connect kids to nature. So that's what that book is.
You talk about not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. So if
That was actually a quote from Einstein.
from Einstein, that's who
Yeah.
it was. I was trying to find that out. You're evoking, for people who know what you're talking about nature and the love that they have for nature, and here in New Mexico, we're a land of great natural beauty, and most people really like to spend some time in it. But how do you? So you're preaching to the choir here. But how do you tell people who are just urban, totally urbanized, don't have parks near them, not even a park? How do you evoke this? How do you? Is there a natural yearning for the natural world?
Well, E.O. Wilson, the great Harvard scientist, a few decades ago came up with the phrase the biophilia hypothesis. And biophilia is love of life, but the biophilia hypothesis is that we are, as a species, hardwired genetically to have an affiliation with the rest of the natural world, and we need that. This is in us. It's never too late. This is part of our fiber, part of our humanity. And I mean, I've gone with gang members from San Diego, inner city San Diego, up to the mountains east of San Diego, and they go up to build trails and all of that. And in the morning, these guys, hardcore 18, 19, 20-year-old gang members, are scared to be out there in the woods.
Yeah.
And I said, what are you scared of? And I asked that of the leader there, the biggest guy, the guy with the most tattoos. And he said, it's too noisy out here. And I said, what do you mean? Your neighborhood, you have gunfire. He said, no. In my neighborhood, there's about 5 sounds, and I know what they all mean. Out here, seems like hundreds of sounds, and I don't know what they mean. Now, they literally, and people who work with young people, taking them out that have never been in nature, particularly from inner cities, they see this phenomenon. But by the end of the day, they see this too. These gang members were like 8-year-olds jumping over a creek. It was in them. It came out. Who they were came out more than maybe it would have without that experience.
Well, are there programs for the inner city kids, for example?
Yeah.
I know of small ones, but is there anybody on a big scale saying, come out and play?
There are a lot of programs that are increasingly doing that. The Y is now interested in that topic. Sierra Club they'll go into inner cities and put backpacks on kids and go for a 5-mile hike in the city looking for nature, and they find it. It's one of the important things to think about here, to realize is that nature isn't just the mountains.
Yeah.
It's also in cities.
And the vacant lots. I grew up loving
Yeah.
vacant lots.
Yeah.
You can find anything there.
And President Obama recently, this is a White House initiative, and I was invited to be at the announcement of this, announced the Every Kid in a Park White House initiative, which is as of last September and for every year. Every 4th grader in America and that 4th grader's family for a whole year will get a free pass to national parks, any federal land and water. A lot of people think it ought to be all kids, and I agree, but it's a great place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. And 4th grade is a really magical.
And they're going to focus on the neighborhoods where kids are least likely to get outside in nature.
Yeah. I think back going to camp was something different in my era because you were actually outside and doing things, in the wild. Now there's computer camps and weight loss camps and drama camps, and they're forgetting the campness of, trudging along through the hot
Yeah.
meadow and then looking in the stream and see who lives there. But at least it's getting kids out of their ordinary context.
And I think there is a return of some of those nature-based camps, and the American Camp Association is really doing some good work in that area.
Good. Well, some kids that we've spoken to say, "Oh, it's too late. The world. It's too late. Climate change and desertification and tract houses. It's too late." But you are very hopeful, and I'd like to have you share some of your hope for a more natural, well-balanced world with our audience.
Well, it's interesting. Last night when I spoke, a young woman came up and actually said, "Now, how do you get to that place where you hope?" And I said, "It's a choice. In truth, there's no practical alternative to hope. Despair doesn't get a lot done. Sometimes despair is needed in order to get to hope."
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need to, Martin Luther King said and demonstrated in many ways that any movement, any culture will fail if it cannot paint a picture of a world that people will want to go to.
Mm.
Right now, I think most Americans, if you ask them what the far future looks like, the images that pop up and that are dominant are images of Blade Runner, Mad Max, at best the Hunger Games. At least there's a few trees. It's a post-apocalyptic world. The number one young adult genre of fiction for several years has been dystopic fiction. It's about a post-apocalyptic world in which not even vampires are having a good time.
Yeah.
I'm not against that kind of literature. I like to read it. But what happens to a culture when the dominant images are like that, and that we don't have another set of images of a beautiful future? Now, we've got a robots are us future that we think about. We have images of that, kind of unsatisfying. We've got a sustainable future. That also is unsatisfying because to most people, sustainable means energy efficient, and it stops there. And it's about survival, sustaining. Like William McDonough says, do you really want a sustainable marriage? Don't you want something better than that? And so that's the reason in Vitamin N and in my sermonettes around the country, I steer away from it's a good word, steer away from the word sustainable or sustainability, because try to imagine a sustainable future. Can you attach beautiful pictures to that? Maybe solar panels, technical things. But that's why I talk about a nature-rich future, nature-rich cities, nature-rich homes and backyards filled with native species that bring back butterfly migration routes, and nature-rich schools. And I visited some just this morning in Santa Fe that are wonderful. A nature-rich life. You can see that future. You can begin to attach pretty quickly images of beauty and life to that image of the future. So I think that's what we need to do.
So we'll say, put the kids in the car and go to the mountains, go to the park, but don't turn on the screens that are now in the car.
Yeah.
Or
Or stay home and redo your yard in native species.
Yeah.
One of the concepts of the nature principle, the second book, is conservation is no longer enough. Now we need to create nature. As strange as that sounds. Even if we preserve, and we should, every square inch of wilderness we still have, it won't be enough for the biodiversity that we need. Therefore, we can change our cities, change our yards, bring back biodiversity where it hasn't been in maybe hundreds of years. And we can do this. Kids can do this in their backyard. One of the ideas in Vitamin N is the idea of a homegrown national park, where thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe around the world, why not call it the worldwide homegrown park, begin to redo their yards in native species, and yard after yard, schoolyard, churchyard, all through this. You'd have wildlife corridors on private land, bringing back the insects that are the basis for the food chain, for biodiversity, bringing back birds, butterflies. We can do this. We don't have to wait for government. We can start tomorrow. See, so it's not just about going out and looking at beautiful mountains. That's important. It's about changing where we live, changing our schools to create this nature-rich life.
And you mentioned something called forest schools in
Yeah.
Europe, where they go outside every day, no matter what the weather is, no matter what, and they're the ones that don't get sick. Raining, snowing, out you go.
Less flu, fewer colds.
Yeah. And one other thing about the psychological benefits of a child in nature or alone in nature,
Yeah.
you talk about that a lot. Just give us a summary of what the science shows us.
One of the most interesting studies is they looked at urban parks, and they found the urban parks with the highest biodiversity are the parks that have the best benefits for psychological well-being for human beings. And I think that has something to do with our feeling alone as a species. We kind of are arrogant about this as a species. We think we can go it alone. Many people do, not all.
Yeah.
And when you are surrounded, I think, by species not our own, it enriches your life. It makes you feel that you're not alone in the universe. And somehow it's just having people around doesn't do that. You have to have people around. You have to have a bond with people. But what about that bond with not only your dog, but with the fox that comes through your yard, with the birds that are in your backyard, with the life all around you? That connection, that bond, I think, is absolutely necessary, not only for us, for our psychological health and well-being, but to help prevent us from destroying those creatures.
Yes.
And I just, the book I'm allegedly working on, next alleged new book, is a book about that bond between humans and other animals. And
Well, when you do finish that book, we would so much like you to come back and tell us about it. I'd like to thank Richard Louv, our guest today, author of Vitamin N, and this wonderful book that I cannot recommend highly enough, Last Child in the Woods. You'll be so glad you read this. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
And I'm Lorene Mills. I'd like to thank you, our audience, for being with us today on Report from Santa Fe. We'll see you next week.
Past archival programs of Report from Santa Fe are available at the website reportfromsantafe.com. If you have questions or comments, please email info@reportfromsantafe.com. Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.